The morning Aaron Fletcher rode up to the Ralston homestead with a carefully rehearsed speech on his lips. He found Mae Ralston already swinging into the saddle of her buckskin mare, and every word he had prepared dissolved like sugar in a rainstorm. The year was 1873, and the Texas Panhandle stretched out in every direction like a rumpled brown blanket thrown over the earth, vast and indifferent and burning with the particular heat of late May. The grass had just come in strong after a wet spring, and the cattle on the Ralston range were fat and restless, ready to move. The drive to Dodge City was set to begin at first light, and Aaron had ridden out the night before, sleeping under the stars at the edge of town so he could arrive early enough to settle this matter before the crew assembled. He had told himself it was only practical. He had told himself it was about keeping order among the drovers, about the rough character of the trail, about river crossings and stampedes, and the kind of men who gathered at night camps along the Kishom extension routes. He had told himself every reasonable, responsible thing a trail boss could tell himself, and he had believed every word of it until he came around the corner of the barn and saw her. Mae Ralston was 24 years old, and she rode like she had been born in the saddle, which was not entirely untrue. Her father, Holt Ralston, had put her on a horse at age 3. He had taught her to rope at 7. He had handed her the bookkeeping ledgers at 15 when his eyesight had begun to fail him, and she had balanced them perfectly every season since. When Holt Ralston had died 2 winters ago of a chest sickness that took him slowly and then all at once, Mae had not sold. She had not packed up. She had hired 2 ranch hands, kept the 2 she already had, and she had run the Ralston operation with a quiet, iron-backed determination that had made some of the neighboring ranchers uncomfortable, and a few of them frankly irritated. Aaron Fletcher had known her for most of those years. He had known her father better, had worked a drive for Holt when Aaron was 19, and Mae was still a girl in braids doing sums at the kitchen table. He was 30 now, and he had spent the last several years building his reputation as a trail boss out of nothing but competence and stubbornness. He ran clean drives. He brought cattle in on time and in good weight, and that reputation had earned him the contract from Mae Ralston to take her herd north. He had not expected her to announce, 3 days before departure, that she intended to ride the drive herself. She had told him over the fence at the south pasture, her voice even and matter-of-fact, like she was telling him the well needed a new rope. She had 412 head ready to go. She had a buyer lined up in Dodge. She had ridden portions of the trail before, she said. She knew the land. He had nodded and said he would think on it, and then he had spent 3 days doing exactly that, and his thinking had arrived at the conclusion that she should not come. The trail was too rough. The drovers were decent men, but not men accustomed to working alongside a woman who owned the cattle. The river crossings in wet season were genuinely dangerous. There would be nights in outlaw country where anything could happen. He had a dozen good reasons. He had laid them out in his mind like fence posts, solid and evenly spaced. Now she was already saddled. Her buckskin mare, a steady animal named Pearl that Mae had raised from a foal, stood square and calm beside the water trough. Mae had her saddle bags packed and tied with the neat, efficient knots of someone who had done this 100 times. She wore a canvas duster over a plain cotton shirt, dark trousers tucked into worn leather boots, and a wide-brimmed hat that had seen many seasons. There was a rifle in the scabbard and a revolver on her hip. She was not dressed for show. She was dressed for riding. She looked at him when he rode into the yard. Her eyes were dark brown, steady, the kind of eyes that waited without fidgeting. "Fletcher," she said by way of greeting. "Miss Ralston," he said, and then the speech he had prepared simply did not come. She raised one eyebrow, not mocking, not challenging. Just waiting. He sat his horse and looked at her for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, and then something in him moved aside as simply and completely as a gate swinging open, and he heard himself say, "We ride in 20 minutes. You might want to tell your house girl where the spare key to the root cellar is." A slow smile crossed Mae Ralston's face, just for a moment before she turned Pearl toward the gate. "Already did," she said. The crew assembled at the south end of the Ralston Range as the sun cracked the horizon. There were 6 drovers in total. Clem Purdy, who was 50 and had made this drive a dozen times and wore his experience like a comfortable coat. Young Sam Briggs, 19, on his first drive, eager and a little jumpy. 2 brothers named Dex and Foster Whalen who worked well together and separately and kept mostly to themselves. A Mexican vaquero named Rodrigo Salinas, who was the best roper Aaron had ever worked with. And a cook named Elias Webb who drove the chuck wagon with a studied aggression that somehow always got the wagon where it needed to be. When the drovers saw me ride up beside Aaron, there was a moment of collective adjustment. Clem Purdy gave Aaron a long, expressionless look. Sam Briggs looked startled and then immediately tried not to look startled. Dex Whalen's mouth pressed into a line, but he said nothing. Rodrigo tipped his hat with professional courtesy. Elias Webb, from the seat of the chuck wagon, simply said, "I will need to know how you take your coffee, Miss Ralston, so I can ignore it and give you what everyone else gets." Me looked at him directly. "Black," she said. "I take it black." Elias nodded with something that approached respect. It was not a clean beginning. There were undercurrents, small eddies of doubt and resistance moving through the crew, and Aaron could feel them. But the cattle were moving, and that was the thing about a drive. Once the herd was in motion, everything else had to follow or be left behind. The first 2 days were straightforward in the way that open country is straightforward, which is to say that they were hard and monotonous and occasionally beautiful. The herd moved at its own pace, which was the pace of cows, which is deliberate and subject to interruption at any moment for no reason at all. Aaron rode point, setting direction. Rodrigo and Dex Whalen rode flank. Foster Whalen and Sam Briggs rode swing. Clem Purdy rode drag and ate dust with the philosophical acceptance of a man who had eaten a great deal of dust in his life. Me rode where she was needed. This surprised Aaron more than he expected. He had half anticipated that she would ride near the front, visible and supervisory, which would have been useless and somewhat irritating. Instead, she seemed to read the herd the way he read it, understanding instinctively where the pressure was, where a steer was thinking about peeling off, where the pace was collapsing on the left side. She moved Pearl smoothly to wherever she was most useful, and she did it quietly, without announcing herself. On the evening of the second day, they camped along a dry creek bed where a trickle of water was still running from the spring rains. Aaron sat near the fire after supper, going over his notes in the small leather-bound journal he kept on every drive, recording mileage, water sources, the condition of the cattle. The rest of the crew had settled into their bedrolls or their quiet conversations, and the night was warm and full of the sounds of cattle and crickets. Me came and sat on a rock a few feet from him, not intrusively, just settling where the light was good enough for the mending she had pulled from her saddle bag, a practical task that managed to look entirely natural. They did not speak for a while. The fire crackled and settled. "You're better out here than I expected," Aaron said, and then immediately recognized that this was a poor way to deliver a compliment. Me looked up from her mending. There was a dry amusement in her expression. "Were your expectations low?" "They were cautious," he said, which was more honest. She returned to her mending. "My father brought me on a short drive when I was 16, 30 head, 2 days north and back. He said if I was going to run this ranch one day I needed to know what happened after the gate opened." She pulled a stitch tight. "He was right about most things." Aaron looked at his journal without reading it. "He was a good man, your father." "Yes," she said simply. "I worked a drive for him when you were maybe 11 or 12. You used to watch us from the fence." Me was quiet for a moment. "I remember," she said. "You were the young one. You argued with my father about the river crossing at Tule Creek. You thought he was taking the herd too far east before the cut through." Aaron stared at her. "I was 19 years old." "You were right," she said. "He told me so that evening. He didn't tell you because he was stubborn, but he told me." Something loosened in Aaron's chest. He could not entirely account for the feeling, so he looked back at his journal and pretended to write something. "Get some sleep," he said. "Tomorrow will be long." She folded her mending away and stood, brushing her hands on her trousers. "It will," she agreed, as if the matter were entirely practical and nothing else, and walked to her bedroll. Aaron sat by the fire for a while longer than he needed to. The third day brought the first real trouble of the drive, and it did not come from the direction he had expected. It came from Sam Briggs. The young drover was green. Aaron had always known that, but he was earnest and he worked hard, and Aaron had judged him capable enough for the drive. What Aaron had not fully accounted for was that Sam Briggs was 24 years old and had spent his whole life in a small town where women were sorted into clear categories, and Mae Ralston did not fit any of them. By the third morning, Sam had begun drifting toward whatever part of the herd Mae was working, offering help she did not need, making conversation she had not solicited, and generally managing to be present in a way that was not yet inappropriate but was moving toward unnecessary. Mae handled it with a patience that Aaron suspected she had developed by dealing with men who underestimated her for years. She was not unkind to Sam. She was simply clear in a way that required him to pay attention to understand. Aaron noticed all of this in the way a trail boss notices everything, filing it under situations to watch. What tipped it was a river crossing. The creek they hit on the third afternoon was running higher than the maps suggested it should, fed by runoff from storms further west. It was not dangerous for experienced riders, but the bank approach was steep and the footing was muddy, and the cattle were already unsettled by the smell of the water. Aaron rode the bank both ways, assessing the best entry point, and he made his decision and called the crossing. Mae took her section of the herd incorrectly. She held the pressure line on the east side of the crossing, keeping the cattle from spreading downstream, her body and Pearl moving in that seamless way that suggested years of practice. Aaron was managing the point animals at the head of the crossing when he heard the commotion behind him. Sam Briggs had pushed his horse up alongside Pearl, presumably to help, and had gotten in Mae's way at precisely the moment she needed a clear line to bring 3 straying steers back to the group. 2 of the steers broke downstream, panicked by the disruption, and for 20 minutes Aaron and Rodrigo and Dex had to work hard in the current to bring them back without losing more. When they finally had the whole herd across and standing in dripping, irritable groups on the far bank, Aaron rode over to Sam. He did not raise his voice. He had learned long ago that raising his voice to a drover in front of the whole crew accomplished nothing useful except making the drover resentful and the cattle nervous. He spoke quietly and directly, and Sam Briggs went quite red and nodded several times and kept his eyes on his saddle horn. Mae, who was well within earshot, did not look over. She was already checking Pearl's footing on the new bank, running her hand down the mare's foreleg with focused attention. Later, when they made camp and the cattle were settled and the supper smell was coming from the chuck wagon, Sam Briggs walked over to where Mae was rubbing Pearl down and said something quiet. Mae listened, nodded once, and said something back. Sam nodded again and walked away, and that was the end of it. Whatever Mae had said had been direct enough to settle the matter and gracious enough to let the boy keep his dignity. Aaron watched this from 30 feet away and felt something shift in his understanding of who Mae Ralston actually was. The 4th and 5th days were long and hot, and the cattle grew restless in the heat, bunching and spreading at unpredictable intervals in the way cattle do when the temperature climbs above what they find reasonable. Aaron pushed the drive to start earlier each morning, getting the miles in before midday, and he called for a longer rest during the worst heat of the afternoon, letting the cattle graze and stand in whatever shade the scrub trees offered. During those afternoon rests, the crew scattered to their own occupations. Clem Purdy slept with the specific dedication of a man who understood that sleep was a resource. The Whalen brothers played cards. Sam Briggs wrote letters home, sitting with his back against a wagon wheel. Rodrigo worked on his tack with the meticulous care of a man for whom equipment was a matter of survival. Aaron often used the time to walk the perimeter of the resting herd, moving slowly and quietly, reading the animals the way you read the weather, looking for signs of sickness or injury or the particular restlessness that preceded a run. On the fifth day, Mae fell into step beside him. She had been doing this gradually, entering his space in increments, each one small enough that he could not quite point to a moment when it had begun. She did not intrude. She matched her pace to his and looked at the cattle with the same attentive eye he was using, and after a while she said things that were relevant and observant, and he responded, and a conversation developed that had the quality of something that had been going on for a long time. "That one," she said, nodding at a steer near the outside of the resting group, a red and white animal that was standing slightly apart and switching his tail more than the others. Aaron had already noticed him. "Leg," he agreed. "Left front. Not bad yet, but I want Rodrigo to look at it tonight." Mae walked a wider circle around the animal, eyeing it from different angles. "He was favoring it a little at the crossing yesterday. I should have said something last night." "I didn't catch it at the crossing," Aaron said. She looked at him. "You were managing the point animals." "That's your herd," he said. "You were right to notice it." She was quiet for a moment, and he had the sense she was deciding whether to say something. Then she said, "You're not what I expected either." He looked at her sideways. "What did you expect?" "Someone who would spend the first week reminding me this was no place for a woman," she said, and there was a faint dryness in it, a humor that acknowledged she had expected the argument and prepared for it. "I thought about saying it," he admitted. "I rode out specifically to say it." "I know," she said. "I saw you coming up the road." He stopped walking. "You knew." "You had the look of someone with a rehearsed speech," she said. "My father had that look sometimes. Usually when he had already decided I was right and was trying to find a way to tell himself he had talked me into it." She paused. "So I got Pearl saddled." Aaron looked at her for a long moment, the sun beating down on both of them, the cattle breathing and shifting nearby. He felt something in him that he could not quite name, something that was composed of admiration and irritation and something warmer than both, and he was not ready to name it yet, so he looked away at the horizon. "That steer needs attention tonight," he said. "Yes," she agreed, and they walked on. Rodrigo examined the steer that evening and declared the problem a small stone bruise that would be fine with careful watching. He said this in the mix of Spanish and English that he used when something mattered enough to say precisely, and Mae understood both halves of it, which earned her an approving nod from the vaquero that Aaron suspected she valued more than she showed. The sixth day brought rain. It came in the night, a slow, steady, serious rain that had no drama in it, just water and more water falling from a gray sky that stretched from one edge of the world to the other. Aaron was awake when it started, lying in his bedroll under the partial shelter of a cottonwood, and he listened to the rain and thought about what it would do to the trail conditions and the creek crossings ahead. None of it was catastrophic. All of it was inconvenient in the way that rain on a cattle drive is always inconvenient. By morning the camp was wet, and the cattle were irritable, and the ground had gone soft and sticky in a way that was hard on horses and harder on the wagon. Elias Webb performed his morning cook-fire operation with the grim, creative expertise of a man who had cooked in every possible weather condition and had opinions about all of them. Mae ate her breakfast standing up, her hat shedding water from the brim in a steady drip, her duster doing its job well enough that only her boots were truly soaked. She looked at the gray sky with the practical assessment of a rancher reading weather, which is to say she was looking for information rather than hoping for comfort. 2 more days of this, she said, when Aaron came to stand beside her with his own cup of coffee. He looked up. "Probably," he said. "The cloud formation is coming from the northwest." "Track east." He paused. "Red Creek is going to be running fast." Mae turned to look at him. Red Creek was the significant water crossing between their current position and the Kansas line. It was manageable in normal conditions. In wet conditions it was a different conversation. "How fast?" she said. Depends on how much fell upstream, he said. We might have to wait it out. She nodded slowly, doing the calculation he was doing, days on the trail against the buyer's timeline in Dodge City. They had a window. It was not a large window. Then we push harder today while we can, she said. Yes, he said, they pushed harder. The day was miserable in the particular way that a day in the rain is miserable when you are on horseback in open country, which is to say it was wet and cold and long, and the cattle did not cooperate, and the mud pulled at everyone's boots and tempers, and the chuck wagon got stuck twice. But the miles came, slowly and definitively, and by the time the rain slackened to a drizzle at dusk, they had covered more ground than Aaron had initially thought possible. At camp, everyone was wet and tired and quiet in the way people get when they have worked hard together in bad conditions, and there is nothing left to say about it. Elias produced a meal that was hot and substantial, and the crew ate with the focused intensity of people who were cold and hungry and had earned their food. Aaron and me sat near the fire after, not quite together but not quite apart, the damp warmth of the fire finding the wet edges of their clothes and working at them gradually. Around them, the crew settled for the night, the sounds of the cattle shifting and breathing in the dark carrying clearly in the washed air. "You're good at this," Mae said, and she said it quietly and simply, not as a compliment offered to gain something but as an observation from someone who had been watching carefully. Aaron looked at the fire. "It's what I know how to do," he said. "No," she said. "There are men who know how to do this and do it badly. You do it well because you care about it." She paused. "You care about the cattle and the men and the land. It shows." He turned to look at her, and she was looking at the fire with those steady dark eyes, and the firelight was doing something to her face that made it difficult to look away. "Your father raised a herd worth driving," he said, which was not what he had meant to say. She smiled at the fire. "He raised me too," she said. Something passed between them in that moment, quiet as a current underwater, and Aaron felt it and knew what it was, and knew also that the timing and circumstances of a cattle drive made it a thing to acknowledge carefully and slowly, if at all. He said, "Get some sleep, Mae," and it was the first time he had used her given name, and she heard it, he could tell by the slight pause before she rose, and she said, "Good night, Aaron," and walked to her bedroll, and Aaron sat with the fire for a long time, thinking about the creek crossing ahead. Red Creek, when they reached it on the 8th day, was running high and brown and fast, carrying debris from the upper country, branches and root clumps, and the occasional piece of something that used to be a fence. Aaron spent the morning of the 8th day riding the banks upstream and downstream, reading the water the way he had been reading water his whole adult life. He found a wide, relatively shallow bend a half-mile upstream from the main crossing, where the water was faster but the bottom was more even and the approach on both sides was less steep. It was not a comfortable crossing. It was the best available option. He brought the crew together and laid out the plan. Rodrigo would go first to test the depth and footing at the approach. Aaron would manage the head of the herd. The Whalen brothers would take the middle. Sam Briggs would manage the downstream pressure with Clem Purdy. Mae would take the upstream side. Mae listened to all of this without expression, then said, "The upstream side will be the hardest." "Yes," Aaron said. She nodded as if this were the obvious assignment and turned Pearl toward the river. The crossing took 2 hours. Rodrigo came back from his test run soaked to the waist and reported that the footing was adequate and the depth was chest-high on his horse at the deepest point, which meant the cattle would swim a few yards. He said this with an equanimity that Aaron appreciated. The cattle did not want to enter the water. This was expected. The first 20 minutes of any high-water crossing is the work of convincing animals that have very reasonable objections to the situation that they are going to do it anyway. Clem Purdy had a gift for this particular persuasion. He talked to cattle. Not in the way people talk to pets, but in a low, continuous murmur that the animals seemed to find authoritative, and he used it now, and slowly the lead animals moved toward the water and then into it. Aaron had the point position and he was in the water almost immediately, his horse Drummond swimming strongly through the deep section, the cool water rushing up to Aaron's thighs and higher before they found the bottom again. He looked back constantly, watching the herd string out into the river, watching his crew. Mae was on the upstream side, exactly where he had placed her, holding the pressure line against the current that wanted to carry the cattle sideways. Pearl moved in the water with a sureness that spoke to the horse's quality and training. Mae's weight was perfectly balanced. Her rope was in hand. When a young steer panicked and tried to turn back against the current, she was there ahead of the thought, blocking the retreat before it became a decision. They lost 2 steers. One was caught by the current and carried downstream before Foster Whalen could cut it off, and it was a hard swim downstream to retrieve it, which Foster managed with considerable proficiency and some damage to his dignity. The other simply got turned around in the deep section and swam back to the near bank, and it took Sam Briggs 20 minutes to convince it to try again. When the last animal came up the far bank and Aaron had done his count and confirmed 412 head present and accounted for, he felt the specific, physical release of a crossing successfully completed. He rode to the top of the bank and looked back across the rushing brown water. Mae was the last rider across. She brought Pearl up the bank in a smooth, controlled scramble, the horse dark with water to the shoulder, Mae herself soaked from the waist down. She pushed her hat back on her head and looked at Aaron with an expression that was partly exhaustion and partly something that was close to joy. 412, she said. 412, he confirmed. She laughed just briefly, a real laugh that surprised her as much as it surprised him, and Aaron felt something happen in his chest that was large and certain, and that he was not going to be able to ignore much longer. He cleared his throat and looked at the herd. 5 more days to Dodge, he said. Then we keep moving, she said, and turned Pearl north. The days that followed had a different quality to them. The rain had passed. The sky had opened into that huge blue that the Texas and Oklahoma territories do in late spring, and the driving was good. The cattle were settled and making miles well, and the crew had found its rhythm, that particular efficiency that develops when the same group of people works the same demanding task together long enough that they stop thinking about the work separately and start operating as a single moving thing. In this rhythm, Aaron and Mae found a natural closeness. It was not dramatic. It was the small things. It was riding point together in the early mornings when the air was still cool, and the cattle were in a traveling mood, and there was no particular emergency to manage, and the conversation that grew in those hours. It was the way she began to trust his assessments, and he began to ask for hers, genuinely and not as courtesy. It was the evening meals where they sat near each other, and the space between them had narrowed without any discussion. The crew noticed. Clem Purdy noticed everything and said nothing, which was his particular way of approving of things. Rodrigo said something in Spanish on the 10th evening that Aaron caught enough of to understand, and the warm amusement in the vaquero's dark eyes made the blood rise in Aaron's neck. Sam Briggs, to his credit, had sorted himself out and was managing his section of the drive with increasing competence and a cheerful good humor that had replaced his earlier awkwardness. On the 9th night, camped on the Oklahoma side of the line in the fading orange light of a spectacular sunset, Aaron told me about the drive he had run as a trail boss for the first time, when he was 26, and the cattle boss who had hired him had come down with fever 2 days in, and Aaron had found himself in charge of 900 head and 7 men and 300 miles of uncertain country. He told it plainly, with the particular kind of honesty that comes out of you when you are tired, and the evening is beautiful, and you are talking to someone who you know will understand it. He told her about the mistake he had made at the second water crossing, pushing too fast in conditions that called for patience, and the steer he had lost because of it. He told her about lying awake that night replaying every decision and feeling the specific misery of a bad call made at the wrong moment. He told her about Clem Purdy, who had been on that drive as well, coming to sit beside him in the dark and saying nothing for 20 minutes and then saying, "You will make that mistake one more time and then you will never make it again," and going back to his bedroll. Me listened to all of this with her knees drawn up and her coffee cup held in both hands. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. "What was the steer's number?" she asked. He blinked. "What?" "The steer you lost." "Do you remember his tag number?" Aaron thought back 11 years. 47, he said, and he was surprised he still knew it. Me nodded slowly. "You remember because you felt responsible." "The same way I remembered that red steer's leg at the crossing even after we made camp, because it is your herd, your responsibility." She looked at him steadily. "That is the difference between someone who drives cattle and someone who cares for them." Aaron looked at her, the last of the sunset going gold behind her, and felt the words settle into him like something that had been missing from a sentence and now made the whole thing make sense. "Where did you learn to see people like that?" he said. She smiled just faintly. "My father would bring workers on for haying season, all sorts of men, some honest and some not. He would watch them for an hour and then tell me what kind of man each one was. After he died, I realized he had been teaching me the whole time, not in words, just by doing it in front of me." Aaron thought about Holt Ralston, that big, weathered, quiet man who had been just and fair and occasionally stubborn in ways that turned out to be right. "He knew you would need it," Aaron said. "He knew I would be running this ranch alone," she said, without bitterness. "He prepared me for what was coming." There was something in that, something about the solitude of the past 2 years, the weight of it, that Aaron heard clearly. He turned toward her slightly, not dramatically, just turning to face what she was saying. "It has been hard," he said, and it was not a question. She looked at the last light on the horizon. "Some days," she said, "the first spring was the hardest, making every decision with no one to check against." She paused. "The men were good. They respected my father's memory, which helped. But there were neighbors who came by with advice I had not asked for and concerns they framed as helpful and were not. Trying to get you to sell," Aaron said, "or to hire a male foreman with authority over operations, which amounted to the same thing with extra steps." She turned to look at him. "You never did that." "No," he said. "You contracted with me the same way you would contract with any ranch owner," she said. "You told me your rate and your terms and you asked mine. You did not suggest I needed a man to review the agreement." Aaron thought about that moment. He had not been consciously principled about it. He had just been dealing with the person in front of him who had been clear and prepared and professional. He said so. "That's its own kind of principle," Me said, and looked back at the horizon. Aaron sat with that for a moment. Then carefully he said, "You said some days are hard. What about the other days?" She was quiet for long enough that he thought she might not answer. Then she said, "The other days, when the ranch is running well and the cattle are healthy and the accounts are balanced and it is mine, completely mine, built and kept by my work, those days are very good." "They should be," he said. She looked at him, and there was something in her eyes that was open and a little vulnerable, the way people look when they have said something true and are watching to see if the other person handles it well. Aaron looked back at her steadily, and she held his gaze for a moment that was longer than purely conversational, and then she looked down at her coffee cup. "We should sleep," she said. "Yes," he said, and neither of them moved for another few minutes. The 11th day brought a problem Aaron had not anticipated. His name was Garrett Loon, and he was the owner of a neighboring spread to the Ralston Ranch, a man in his 40s with a broad face and a confidence in his own authority that had never been seriously challenged. He appeared on the trail with 2 riders, riding to intersect the drive at a point where the route passed near the boundary of his land. Aaron saw him coming from 200 yards and read the body language of the approach before he could make out the face. He rode out to meet them, keeping his own posture easy and his horse Drummond moving at a walk that communicated no urgency and no nervousness. Garrett Loon pulled up 30 yards from the front of the herd. His 2 men flanked him. "Fletcher," he said, and then looked past Aaron at the herd. "Whose cattle?" "Ralston," Aaron said. Something in Loon's expression shifted. He looked further back, past the herd, and Aaron knew he was looking for me. "I heard the Ralston girl was running this drive herself," Loon said, and the word girl was not quite an insult, but it was not quite not one either. "Miss Ralston is the ranch owner," Aaron said. "She has every right to accompany her herd." Loon's gaze moved back to him. "I have an interest in the Ralston operation," he said, with the careful phrasing of a man who has been turned down before and is still not entirely sure how it happened. "I made an offer on that land 2 years running. I think it would be worth having a conversation with her about the road ahead for a single woman operating alone." Aaron kept his voice even. "Miss Ralston's land and business decisions are her own," he said. "She knows where to find you if she wants that conversation." Loon's eyes narrowed slightly. "Is she going to make it all the way to Dodge City?" "The drive is on schedule," Aaron said. There was a pause in which Garrett Loon assessed whether to push further and appeared to decide against it, though not gracefully. He turned his horse. His 2 men followed. They rode away without anything else said. Aaron turned Drummond back toward the herd and found me riding toward him, having watched the exchange from 100 yards back. Her expression was carefully neutral in the way you keep your face neutral when you already know what a conversation was about and have been through it many times. "Loon," she said. "Yes," Aaron said. "He wants the ranch." "He does," Aaron said. "He also thinks the road ahead is difficult for a single woman operating alone." Me looked at the retreating riders. "Then he should watch the rest of this drive," she said, with a quiet coolness that Aaron found, frankly, magnificent. They moved the herd on. That evening, with the Kansas line very close and Dodge City 3 days away, the crew was in good spirits. Elias produced an unusually good supper, beans and salt pork and cornbread, that was better than it had any right to be given the circumstances. And Clem Purdy produced a small bottle of whiskey that he shared with a restraint that suggested he had considerable experience rationing exactly this much goodwill. Aaron drank his small portion and sat with the good ache of 10 days hard riding settled into his muscles. Around the fire, the drovers talked and laughed, and the cattle were calm and the night was clear, and he was aware, with a pleasant and slightly alarming clarity, that he did not want this drive to end. Me sat across the fire from him. She was talking with Rodrigo about something, laughing at something he said in his mix of Spanish and English, and the firelight made her face animated and warm, and Aaron watched her without meaning to, cataloging the things he had learned about her in 11 days on the trail. The way she woke up completely, no gradual assembly required, ready and present the moment her eyes opened. The way she handled Pearl, which was to say the way she handled every living thing she was responsible for, with attention and patience and a firmness that came from knowing what she was doing. The way she listened, really listened, when someone was talking to her, her whole body turned toward the speaker. The way she had looked at him by the fire 2 nights ago, open and a little uncertain, and the fact that she could be uncertain at all, Mae Ralston, who rode at the front of her own cattle drive, seemed to him the most valuable thing he had learned. Clem Purdy appeared beside him with no particular warning, which was how Clem generally appeared. "You know what you are looking at," Clem said, not as a question. Aaron looked at the fire. "Mind your business, Clem." Clem was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "She is a good woman, Aaron, the genuine article, not many of them in this country or any other." He stood up with the deliberate care of a man whose knees were not interested in quick movements and walked away. Aaron sat with the fire until it died to coals. He was still sitting there when Mae returned from checking on Pearl, which she did each night before sleeping, and found him by the coals. She stopped and looked at him. In the dark her eyes were just shadows, but her posture was open, no guard up. "Can't sleep," she said. "Thinking," he said. She sat down, not at her usual distance, but closer, close enough that he was very aware of it. "About what?" she said. He turned to look at her, and it was dark enough that he could say true things. "About what happens in 3 days," he said. She was quiet, and he knew she understood him. "The herd gets sold," she said. "You get paid, we ride south." "Yes," he said, "and?" She was quiet again, longer this time. An owl called somewhere in the dark, that hollow, clear sound. "And I go back to the ranch," she said, "and you go to the next drive. Is that what happens?" He said. She turned to look at him, and even in the dark he could see the steadiness of her. "I don't know," she said honestly. "What do you want to happen?" Aaron had not said what he wanted out loud in a very long time. It was not a skill he had practiced. He looked at her in the dark and thought about the fact that she had asked him a direct question and deserved a direct answer. "I want to not ride away in 3 days like this drive was only a business arrangement," he said. "Because it is not only that anymore, and I think you know it." Mae was still. He could not tell from her stillness whether he had said too much or exactly enough. Then she said, "I know it," and her voice was quiet and serious and completely certain. Aaron exhaled slowly. Something in him that had been held carefully for 11 days released, and he became aware of how close she was sitting and of the fact that he was not going to lean toward her right now, not out here in the dark with the crew asleep 20 feet away, but he was going to remember this moment for a very long time. "We will talk in Dodge," he said. "Yes," she said. "We will." She did not move away immediately. They sat in the dark close for a while longer, and the night was good, and the coals were warm, and the cattle breathed quietly in the dark. The last 3 days to Dodge City had their own particular urgency. They pushed hard, not recklessly but with purpose, and the countryside opened up into the broader Kansas plains that rolled and shimmered in the heat in a way that made Dodge City seem both close and somehow floating, a mirage of civilization at the edge of the grass. The Kishom Trail in 1873 was busy. They came into the wider trails north of Caldwell and found themselves riding alongside the evidence of other drives, old camp circles, the manure and hoof-churned earth of other herds that had passed days before. The town was an accumulation of all that grass and beef and the money that moved between them, and its particular mixture of commerce and rough entertainment was visible from miles out in the number of riders and wagons moving along the trail. Mae had been to Dodge City once before, she told him on the last day, riding beside him at the front of the herd. She had come with her father when she was 17 to watch him close a sale, a girl at the edge of a man's world, watching and learning. Now she was riding in with her own cattle, her own contract, her own account to settle. "How does it feel?" Aaron asked. She thought about it honestly. "Like something my father would be proud of," she said, "and like something I did myself." She glanced at him. "Both of those are true at the same time." "They should be," he said. Dodge City in late May was crowded and loud and smelled aggressively of cattle and human commerce. The pens along the railroad were already filling with other herds, and the sounds of the stockyards, lowing cattle, the calls of the yard workers, the distant clanking of the rail equipment, filled the air with the particular music of the end of a drive. Aaron brought the herd in smooth and steady, moving through the stockyard entrance with a control that came from the whole crew being fully functional, every rider in the right place, the cattle moving with the tired, obedient calm of animals who had been handled well for 2 weeks and trusted the people around them. The sale took several hours. Mae handled it herself, which Aaron had expected. The buyer was a Kansas City man named Ellsworth, a professional of the stockyard world who had seen thousands of Texas cattle come up the trail and had a manner that was polite and assessing in equal measures. He did not comment on the fact that his seller was a woman. He looked at the cattle, asked his questions about condition and origin and drove dates, and Mae answered everything directly and accurately, and the price was negotiated and agreed to with a crisp professionalism that left Ellsworth looking satisfied. When the paperwork was signed and the bank draft folded into Mae's inner coat pocket, she stood outside the stockyard office for a moment, squinting in the late afternoon sun. Aaron came to stand beside her. She held up the bank draft between 2 fingers, not showing it off but acknowledging it. Then she folded it back into her pocket and looked at him with an expression that was relief and satisfaction and something else, something that was looking ahead. "Same rate you quoted in February," she said, "for the crew and yourself." "That is what we agreed," he said. "And a bonus," she said, "because you brought them all in without a loss after that crossing." Aaron shook his head. "That is your money for next season." "It is my money and I am choosing to pay it," she said, with the particular finality of someone who has done the math and made the decision and is not interested in reversing it. He looked at her and felt a smile pull at the corner of his mouth. "You are very difficult to argue with," he said. "My father said the same thing," she said, and smiled back. The crew collected their pay at the hotel, and Aaron gave them the usual warning about responsible behavior in town, which they received with the usual polite skepticism of men who had been riding hard for 2 weeks and had plans for their first evening in Dodge City that he did not need to know about. Clem Purdy collected his pay and said to Aaron with his usual economy of expression, "Well done," and then to me, "Your father would have enjoyed watching that crossing." He walked away before either of them could respond. Rodrigo tipped his hat to me and said something in Spanish that Aaron caught this time, and it was genuinely gracious, and me's reply in Spanish surprised the vaquero into a broad smile. Sam Briggs, collecting his envelope, said to me, "You are the best rider on this crew, Miss Ralston, and I include myself and Fletcher in that," which was both generous and probably accurate. And then the crew dispersed into the evening, and it was Aaron and me standing outside the hotel in the gold late light of Dodge City, and the thing they had said they would discuss was available to discuss. Me tilted her head toward the small restaurant across the street from the hotel. "I am going to have a meal that someone else cooked," she said. "Come with me." "Yes," he said. The restaurant was simple but clean, run by a woman of about 50 who seated them without ceremony at a corner table and brought coffee without being asked. They ordered, the particulars of the food secondary, to the fact of sitting across from each other at a table like normal people, no cattle in the immediate vicinity, no river crossings pending. For a while they talked about the drive, settling the last practical matters, the arrangements for the crew's return south, the condition of the horses, the plan for getting back to the Ralston ranch. It was the conversation that needed to happen, practical and clear. Then the practical matters were settled and the food arrived and they ate, and when the edges of hunger were off and the evening had settled into something quieter, Aaron set down his fork and looked at her directly. "I told you I did not want to ride away like this was only a business arrangement," he said. "You did," she said. "I meant it." "I know you meant it," she said. "I mean it too." He looked at her for a moment. "I have a good reputation and enough saved to lease land," he said. "I have been thinking about running my own operation instead of contracting drives." Me was listening with the full quality of attention he had learned was distinctly hers. "Is there a direction that thinking has been going?" she said. "Southeast," he said. She held his gaze. "Southeast of Dodge City is the Texas Panhandle," she said. "It is," he said. The corner of her mouth moved. "The Ralston land runs along the South Fork of the Canadian," she said. "The east pasture has good winter grass." Aaron felt his heart doing something large and somewhat inconvenient in his chest. "I know it," he said. "I have ridden that land." "There is a line cabin on the east pasture," she said. "My father built it for the far work. It has been empty since he passed." "Me," he said, because he needed to use her name and have her hear it. "Aaron," she said back, and there was something in the way she said it, steady and warm and completely present, that made him understand she was not offering him a line cabin. She was telling him something larger. He reached across the table and she met him halfway, her hand in his, both of them calloused and work-worn and warm from the coffee cup. "I am asking if I can court you properly," he said, "when we get back. Not on the trail, not as your trail boss, but as myself." She looked at him across the table and her eyes were dark and clear and entirely certain. "You can," she said. He held her hand and looked at her and felt the specific, rare sensation of something important becoming real. "Good," he said. The ride south from Dodge City was different from the ride north, unburdened by cattle, the horses moving at their own pace, the miles coming back at a traveling gait rather than the patient 3-mile-per-hour pace of a herd. The crew rode together for the first 2 days and then peeled off in their various directions, each man heading for his own home ground. Rodrigo and Aaron embraced in the way of men who have been through hard country together, firmly and briefly. Clem Purdy shook Aaron's hand and said to me, "Next spring, if you are running a drive, I expect to hear about it," and she told him he would. Sam Briggs rode off at a gallop, his youth restored to him now that the drive was done and he was heading home. The Whalen brothers lifted their hats and went. Elias Webb, loading the last of the chuck wagon's supplies for the return to his winter kitchen outside of Caldwell, said to Aaron, "She is a fine woman, Fletcher. Don't be slow about it." Then he climbed onto the wagon seat and drove away. The last stretch back to the Ralston ranch was 2 days' ride, just Aaron and me and 2 horses and the big summer sky of the Panhandle opening up around them. They rode without urgency, talking when they felt like it, comfortable in the silences when they did not. Me told him about her plans for the ranch, the expansion she had been working toward, a second breeding season with better bulls, the fence line repairs she had been deferring, the possibility of a second water tank on the north pasture. She spoke about it with the specific pleasure of someone whose plans are real and executable, not daydreams. Aaron listened and asked questions and found himself thinking about those plans as shared plans, naturally and without forcing it. He told her about the land he had been considering, a parcel east of her range that was available for lease at a price he could manage. She told him she knew that parcel, that it ran alongside the Ralston East fence for about 2 miles, that the grass on it was good. "Good enough to run 30 head the first season," he said. 40, she said. "If you use the east pasture for summer rotation." He looked at her. "That is your pasture. I know whose pasture it is," she said. Aaron rode in silence for a moment, looking at the country around them, the long grass moving in the afternoon wind, the sky enormous and blue and full of promise. "You are already planning the whole operation," he said. "Someone has to," she said, with the dry amusement that was entirely hers. He laughed genuinely and fully out here in the open under the sky, and she laughed too, and Pearl and Drummond flicked their ears at the sound. They arrived at the Ralston Ranch on a warm Thursday afternoon in early June. The house was as me had left it, the house girl, a capable young woman named Ada, coming out to the porch with evident relief, and a list of items that required attention, which me received with calm efficiency that suggested this was a familiar reunion. Aaron saw to the horses, settling Drummond in the Ralston barn with Pearl and taking his time with the unsaddling and brushing, giving the horse what the animal deserved after 2 weeks on the trail. When he came out of the barn into the slanted afternoon light, me was on the porch with her jacket off, going through the mail that Ada had collected, sorting it with quick, practiced movements. She looked up when he came out of the barn. The ranch was quiet around them, the home pasture cattle moving slowly in the late afternoon light, the windmill turning. "You can stay for supper," she said. "I will do that," he said. He did stay for supper, and then he stayed to fix a fence post that had been listed in Ada's report as needing immediate attention. And by the time the fence post was fixed and the tools were put away it was dark, and me had a lamp burning on the porch, and he sat on the porch steps and she sat in the wooden chair her father had built and they talked until a reasonable hour, and then he rode back to town. He came back the next day, and the day after that. The courtship that followed was conducted in the way of practical people, which is to say it was not separate from life, but woven into it. Aaron leased the east parcel and began working it, and the fence line that me had mentioned did indeed run alongside the Ralston East pasture for 2 miles, and many of the most important conversations of that summer happened along that fence line, on horseback, looking at the grass and the sky, and occasionally each other. He worked his parcel during the day and came to the Ralston ranch in the evenings, sometimes for supper and sometimes to help with whatever the day had left undone, and the easy domesticity of it crept up on them both gradually, and then settled around them like something that had always been true. There were evenings on the porch in the warm August dark when they sat close and talked about everything and nothing. And the talking became less and less the point, and the proximity more and more. The first time he took her hand in a context that was not the restaurant in Dodge City, not a bridge between a question and an answer, but simply because it was there and he wanted to hold it. She looked down at their joined hands and then up at him with an expression that was entirely unguarded. The first time he kissed her was in October, on horseback, at the corner of the east fence line, on a gold afternoon when the cottonwoods along the creek had gone the color of sunlight. He had turned to say something about the northwest corner post that needed resetting before winter, and she had turned at the same moment, and they were very close, and he paused and she did not move away, and he kissed her. It was brief and serious and entirely certain on both sides, and when they pulled back they looked at each other in the way people look at something they have been expecting for a long time and are relieved to have finally arrived at. "The Northwest Post," she said, after a moment. "Yes," he said. "It needs resetting before winter." "We should do that today," she said. "Yes," he said, and they rode to fix it, and the afternoon was very good. By November, Aaron had moved into the line cabin on the east pasture, close enough that the Ralston house was a 10-minute ride, far enough that the arrangement was respectable in the way that 1873 Texas required respectability. He had cattle on the east parcel, 32 head to start, and the Ralston hands had accepted his presence with the uncomplicated practicality of men who valued competent work, and saw clearly that things were moving in a direction that made sense. The neighbors were a more varied matter, most of them adjusted without much difficulty. Mae Ralston's operation had been running successfully, and they had seen enough of it to accept that she knew what she was doing, and a man like Aaron Fletcher being associated with it made sense to them. A few of them had opinions, always framed as concern for Mae's well-being, always really about the discomfort of seeing a woman who did not need their help not needing their help. Mae handled them the way she handled most things she did not have time for, briefly and with complete finality. Garrett Loon was the exception. He appeared at the Ralston fence line in November with 2 riders, as he had appeared on the trail drive, and he waited for Aaron to ride over to him, which Aaron did. "You are living on her land," Loon said. "I am leasing the east parcel," Aaron said. "The title is clear and the lease is recorded at the county seat." "You are building something on her operation," Loon said, and the way he said building had a flavor of accusation. "I'm working my lease and doing work on the Ralston ranch as a neighbor helps a neighbor," Aaron said. "I know what you are doing, Fletcher," Loon said. Aaron looked at him without particular heat. "Then you know there is nothing to discuss," he said. Loon's jaw tightened. He was a man who was unaccustomed to not getting what he wanted by sheer weight of persistence, and Aaron had met men like him before and knew that the only response they respected was a clear refusal with no debate attached to it. He held Loon's gaze until the other man looked away, and then he turned his horse and rode back to the fence line work he had been doing. Mae had been watching from the far side of the pasture. When he came back, she rode over. "Loon," she said. "Yes," Aaron said. He picked up his fence tool and went back to work. "He has given up," he added. "He just doesn't know it yet." She watched him work for a moment. "Thank you," she said. "You do not need thanking," he said. "That was my fence line to defend." She was quiet, and then she said, "Aaron." He looked up. She was looking at him with that expression, the open, clear one, the one he had been collecting since the first night by the fire. "Will you ask me?" she said, simply and directly, which was exactly who she was. Aaron set down the fence tool and looked at her across the fence line that ran between their properties, both of them on horseback, the November sky cold and bright over the Panhandle. "Mae Ralston," he said, "will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, without hesitation, without performance, with the full certainty of someone who had known the answer for a long time and was glad to be asked. He smiled, broadly and without trying to manage it, and she smiled back, and Pearl stamped a foot in the cold grass as if agreeing with the decision. They were married in December, a ceremony at the small church in town that the Panhandle settlement had built 3 years before. It was a plain wedding in the way that practical people make things plain, without excess, but there was enough of the town present that it had warmth to it. And Elias Webb, who had heard the news via some combination of cattle trail communication and sheer will, appeared at the church door that morning, having ridden 4 days from Caldwell, which made me laugh with genuine surprise and Aaron shake the old cook's hand very firmly. Clem Purdy was there, looking exactly as he always looked, wearing a clean shirt that was his only visible concession to the occasion. He sat in the front row and watched the proceedings with an expression of deep satisfaction. Rodrigo had sent a letter that arrived the week before, written in Spanish with an English postscript that said simply, "It is about time," which Aaron read aloud to me, and which she agreed with completely. Sam Briggs came, younger and more earnest than ever, and gave a toast at the small supper afterward that was heartfelt and somewhat rambling, and ended with a sincere compliment to me's writing skills that was, under the circumstances, exactly right. Aaron stood beside me at the head of the table at their wedding supper and looked at her, his wife, and felt the specific, enormous truth of the words settle into him. She was looking at the faces of the people around the table with that full attention quality she brought to everything, present and warm, her hand resting on the table near his. He covered her hand with his, and she turned to look at him, and her eyes were dark and warm and completely certain. "Hello, Mrs. Fletcher," he said, and the pleasure of saying it surprised him. "Hello, husband," she said, and the word in her voice was a new sound that he was going to be hearing for the rest of his life, and was already decided that he liked. The first year of their marriage had the quality of something built well, solid and functional and occasionally difficult and frequently satisfying. They merged the East Parcel operation with the Ralston operation formally in the spring, Aaron buying in with what he had saved over 11 years of trail bossing, and what had been the Ralston Ranch became Fletcher Ralston, though me kept the name in the signage because it was the name the land knew, and Aaron had no objection. They ran the spring drive together that year, the full 1,000 head that their combined herds produced, and Aaron was trail boss with the complete and unambiguous authority of a man whose wife owned half the cattle and was riding at his side. The crew was slightly larger, and they had hired 2 more hands for the ranch operation, and one of them was a woman. Her name was Clara Voss, 22 years old, come west from Missouri after her family's farm was lost to debt, and she could handle cattle and horses and could ride all day, and me had hired her on the spot when she showed up at the ranch gate asking for work. Some of the neighboring ranchers had opinions about this. Me said clearly that she hired on competence and Clara Voss was competent, and that was the end of that conversation, which Aaron agreed with and said so. The spring drive of 1874 went to Dodge City in good order. 411 head on arrival out of Fort Wells started. The one lost a natural illness that had nothing to do with the management of the drive. The sale was strong, the buyer was satisfied, and Aaron and me rode back south with a bank draft that meant the winter improvements on the ranch could proceed without compromise. They were home by early July, and the ranch was running well, and that was a good summer in all the ways that matter. In September, me told him, quietly and with that particular certainty she brought to important things, that she was expecting a child. She was sitting on the porch in the evening light, the way she sat every evening now, and she said it looking at the home pasture and the cattle moving against the sunset, as if she were telling him about a good piece of news from the ledger, and then she turned to look at him with something in her face that was larger than the even voice had suggested. Aaron was quiet for a moment that was not calculation, but was something more like trying to find a place large enough to put the feeling. "Are you well?" He said first because that was the most important question. "Perfectly well," she said. "Strong." "Good," he said. And then, because it was completely true, "I am very glad." She leaned against his shoulder, which was not something she did often, me being constitutionally more prone to sitting beside him than leaning against him, and he put his arm around her, and they looked at the sunset and the cattle and the home pasture that was theirs, and the feeling was enormous and quiet at the same time, the way the best feelings tend to be. Their son was born in April of 1875, on the ranch, in the main bedroom of the house that had been Holt Ralston's house and was now theirs. He was healthy and loud, and had a quantity of dark hair that surprised everyone, including the woman who attended the birth, a practical and experienced woman from town named Mrs. Gaines, who had brought half the children of that county into the world, and had strong opinions about how things ought to be done. Aaron, who had sat outside the bedroom door for 6 hours with the specific, helpless anxiety of a man who can fix almost any problem except the one happening on the other side of a closed door, was allowed in when it was over to find me tired and completely present, her son in her arms, looking down at the baby with an expression that was entirely new on her face and entirely recognizable at the same time. She looked up at him when he came in, and her eyes were bright. "Come and see," she said. He crossed the room and looked at his son, small and red-faced and furiously alive in me's arms, and felt something that did not have a name and did not need one. "He looks angry," Aaron said. "He is new," me said. "He has a right to be." Aaron sat on the edge of the bed and me leaned against him, and they looked at the baby together. "Holt," Aaron said, which he had been thinking about since October without saying. "For your father." Me was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Holt Aaron Fletcher," and her voice was steady and warm and a little thick. "Yes," Aaron said. Little Holt Aaron Fletcher arrived on the Panhandle Range in the spring of 1875 and took to it immediately, in the way that children take to the world they are given. By the time he was 2, he was following Aaron around the barn with the focused intentionality of someone studying a subject, and me had a photograph of it, taken by the traveling photographer who came through town that year. Aaron bent over some piece of equipment with his son beside him in miniature, both of them looking at the same thing. The photograph went on the wall beside the one of Holt Ralston, and me looked at both of them sometimes in the evenings, with an expression that was sorrow and gratitude in equal measure. In the spring of 1876, they ran the drive again, and me rode the drive with her young son left in Ada's excellent care, which me organized with the thoroughness she brought to everything. The separation was the hardest part for her, Aaron knew, and he knew it partly because she said so, and partly because he had learned to read her well enough that he could see it in the set of her shoulders the first morning out. "He will be fine," Aaron said. "I know he will," she said. "Ada is more capable than most people I have met." A pause. "I just miss him already." "Then we make good miles," Aaron said, "and come home soon." She looked at him with that look, warm and direct and entirely his. "Then we make good miles," she agreed. They made good miles. The drive that year was the smoothest they had run together, 470 head, a new crew member who had come up from South Texas with a solid reference from Rodrigo, and the whole machinery of it running with the confidence of a second year's experience. Dodge City received them on schedule, and the sale was strong, and they were home in late June to find little Holt healthy and loud, and very pleased to see his mother, which he expressed by wrapping his arms around her knees and not letting go for several minutes. Aaron stood in the doorway of the ranch house and watched me kneel down to hold her son, his brown arms around her neck and her laughing, and his son's small voice saying words that were mostly intelligible and entirely emphatic, and the sight of it filled him completely. By 1877, Garrett Loon had finally sold his operation and moved further north, unable or unwilling to continue in the increasingly organized and competitive Panhandle Range country, and the land was bought by a family named Coplin who came out from Tennessee and who proved to be good neighbors, the kind who respected fence lines and returned cattle that wandered and knew when to help and when to leave other people alone. The Coplin family had a daughter, Sarah, who was 17, and a son named Will who was 19 and looking for ranch work, and Aaron hired Will Coplin for the summer season and found him competent and honest. Me helped Sarah Coplin, who wanted to learn the ranch accounts, in the same direct and methodical way that Holt Ralston had taught me, and Sarah proved to be quick and interested. "Your father taught you this way," Aaron said one evening, watching me work through the ledger columns with Sarah at the kitchen table. Me looked up. "Yes," she said. "He taught me by doing it in front of me and letting me ask questions." "He taught you to teach," Aaron said. Me smiled at that, one of her real smiles, full and warm, and went back to the ledger. In the fall of that year, Clara Voss, who had been with the ranch for 3 years and had become a fully capable ranch hand and someone me considered a friend, told them she was leaving to go back to Missouri. Her mother was ill and her family needed her. She left at the end of October with a good horse that me gave her as a going-away gift, and a letter of reference in Aaron's hand that said clearly and specifically what she had done, and how well she had done it. And she hugged me at the gate and rode away eastward with the efficient sadness of someone who has made a decision they know is right. Me stood at the gate until Clara was out of sight and Aaron stood beside her. "She will come back west," me said. "She is a western woman. The east won't hold her." "Probably," Aaron said. "I will keep the position open," me said, which was her way of saying that Clara would have a place on the Ralston-Fletcher operation whenever she was ready to return. Clara Voss did come back, 2 years later, with her mother recovered and a year of Missouri winter behind her and an eagerness to be back in open country that was evident from the moment she rode into the yard. Me met her at the gate and said, "Your bed is still in the bunkhouse," and that was that. By 1878, the Fletcher-Ralston Ranch had grown into one of the solid, well-regarded operations of the Panhandle, not the largest, but consistently well-managed, with cattle that were in good condition and accounts that balanced and a reputation for dealing fairly. Aaron was known as a man who had been a first-rate trail boss and had put that competence into building something permanent, and me was known as a rancher of the first order, and those two reputations together made for an operation that the county respected. There were harder years ahead, as there are always harder years ahead in the cattle business. There was a drought year that reduced the grass and required difficult decisions about the herd. There was a winter that came early and mean and cost them 8 head and 2 months of exhausting cold weather management. There was a year when beef prices dropped in Dodge City and the drive profits barely covered the operating costs, and they sat at the kitchen table with the ledgers and looked at the numbers and made the adjustments that needed making. None of it broke them. Me brought to difficulty the same quality she brought to everything, which was the attention and patience and firm groundedness of someone who had been prepared for this life by a father who loved her. And Aaron brought to it the competence and stubbornness and deep caring of a man who had made this land his own by choosing it clearly and working it hard. They were a good partnership. They were also, in the private hours between the practical life of the ranch, entirely in love in the way that builds over years rather than arriving all at once, deepening and solidifying, becoming more real rather than less. Aaron came home from a fence survey on the East Parcel one October afternoon in 1878 and found me at the kitchen table writing a letter, which was not unusual, and found little Holt, now 3 years old, asleep in the corner with his head on a saddle blanket, which was exactly the sort of thing that happened when Holt Fletcher was on the premises, and found me looking up at him with that expression, the open one, the certain one, and heard her say, "There will be another child in the spring." He sat down at the table across from her and reached for her hands and held them. "A brother for Holt," he said. "Or a sister," she said. "Or a sister," he agreed. "It was a girl." They named her Alina Mae Fletcher, after no one and everyone, and she arrived in April of 1879 with the strong lungs and absolute presence of someone who had decided to be here and was not going to be quiet about it. Little Holt, by then 4 years old and possessed of very firm opinions about nearly everything, inspected his sister with the serious attention of someone conducting a review. "She is loud," he said. "She is," Aaron agreed. "She is loud like a calf," Holt said. "Holt," Mae said from the bed, with the dry amusement of a woman who had just done an enormous amount of hard work and was not going to let it prevent her from being funny. A healthy calf, Aaron said to Holt, man to man. Holt considered this acceptable and went back to his inspection. Mae Fletcher grew into a child with her mother's eyes and her father's stubbornness, and her own particular quantity of determination that was entirely hers. By the time she was 2, she was following the ranch hands around with the same focused intentionality that Holt had brought to following Aaron. And the ranch hands, who had seen this pattern before, accepted the situation with the resigned good humor of people who know when they are outmatched. The spring of 1880 brought a good season, the grass coming in strong after adequate winter rains, the cattle in excellent condition, the ledgers showing the careful accumulation of 7 years of solid work. Aaron stood at the south fence one morning in early April, looking at the home pasture full of cattle and the house in the distance with its lamp already lit in the kitchen and smoke coming from the chimney where Mae was making coffee, and felt the full weight of what they had built. He had been a trail boss once, moving other people's cattle through other people's country, good at it, built for it, rootless by design. Now he was standing on his own land, his name on the deed alongside hers, his children inside that house, his cattle on that grass. The rootlessness had been a kind of waiting. He had not known it until it ended. He went back to the house and came through the kitchen door into the warm smell of coffee and the sound of 2 children, and Mae's voice saying something to Alina about keeping her hands off the stove, and Holt's voice asking a question about something that required going to the barn to answer properly, and the morning was entirely ordinary and entirely everything. Mae handed him a coffee cup without looking up from the stove. He took it and stood in his kitchen and looked at his wife and felt, with simple and complete certainty, that this was the life he had ridden toward without knowing it, across 11 days of drive and 100 miles of Texas Panhandle, and one morning, when she had already saddled Pearl, and he had moved aside because moving aside was the only thing that made any sense. Later, sitting on the porch in the evening with Alina on his knee making determined attempts on his coffee cup, and Holt running the perimeter of the yard with the purposeless energy of a 5-year-old boy, and Mae sitting in her father's wooden chair with the mending she always had and the lamplight on her face, Aaron said, "Do you remember when I rode out to tell you the cattle drive was no place for a woman?" Mae looked up from her mending. Her eyes were warm and amused. "I remember," she said. "What would you have done," he said, "if I had actually managed to say it?" She considered this with the seriousness she brought to genuine questions. "Listened politely," she said. "And then ridden out anyway." "Yes," he said, "I know." "Did you?" she said. "I think I knew it from the moment I came around the corner of the barn and saw Pearl already saddled," he said. "I think that is why I forgot the speech." Mae set down her mending and looked at him across the porch with those dark, steady, warm eyes that he had been looking at for 7 years and had never stopped wanting to look at. "You moved aside," she said. "You were already going," he said, "and you were right to go." She smiled at that, quietly and completely, the smile that was only for him, the one she did not perform for the world, and she picked her mending back up, and Alina made another move on the coffee cup, and Aaron lifted it out of reach, and Holt came skidding to a stop at the porch steps and announced that he had found a lizard and wanted advice on what to do with it. The evening settled around them, warm and full, the Panhandle sky going from orange to purple to the deep blue of a night coming in clear and cool. The cattle moved in the home pasture. The windmill turned. The lamp burned in the kitchen behind them. Aaron Fletcher sat on the porch of the ranch he had built with his wife on her father's land in the Texas Panhandle in the year 1880, his daughter on his knee and his son at his feet and Mae in the chair beside him, and felt the word home settle into him with the weight and permanence of something that had been put in its right place and would stay there. "Fletcher," Mae said, without looking up from her mending. "Yes," he said. "That lizard is going to end up in the house." "Holt," Aaron said, "the lizard stays outside." "But father," Holt said, "Outside," Mae said without looking up. Holt Fletcher looked at the lizard in his hand, looked at his parents, and made the calculation that children make when they understand that two people are in complete agreement and resistance is unproductive. He walked off the porch and into the yard and set the lizard carefully at the base of the fence post, watching it go with the philosophical acceptance that he had inherited in approximately equal measure from both of his parents. The night came on slowly and beautifully, as nights do in open country when there is no hurry, and the stars came out one by one and then all at once, and the cattle settled for the night, and inside the kitchen the stove ticked with cooling heat, and the lamp burned steady, and the Fletcher Ralston ranch was quiet and good. This was the life. This was exactly the life. And it was real, and it was theirs, and it was going to keep.